June 17, 1943, New York Harbor. The transport ship Edmund B. Alexander cut through morning fog carrying 1,200 German prisoners of war captured in Tunisia. Below deck, Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his face against a porthole, watching the Manhattan skyline emerge like a vision from another universe. 19 years old. Believer. Hitler Youth graduate. Warrior of the 1,000-year Reich. He had been prepared for death in combat, prepared for torture in captivity, prepared for the collapse and starvation he had been promised awaited in America. He was not prepared for this. Skyscrapers piercing clouds, ships crowding the harbor in numbers that made his training officers' assurances of U-boat supremacy seem laughable, docks bustling with cranes and trucks in activity that spoke not of a nation on the verge of collapse, but of industrial might beyond comprehension. The other prisoners crowded behind him, silent, staring. Someone whispered what they all thought. Mein Gott, they lied to us. The propaganda had been specific, detailed, confident. America was internally divided, economically devastated, militarily incompetent, culturally degenerate. What Klaus saw through that porthole shattered every certainty he possessed, not through violence, but through something more devastating to ideology, undeniable reality. The indoctrination had begun in childhood. Klaus Zimmermann, like millions of German boys, had joined the Hitler Youth at age 10 in 1934. The organization was not optional, not really. Families that resisted found themselves under scrutiny, their children excluded from schools and opportunities. The training was comprehensive, systematic, designed to shape minds before they developed the capacity for critical thought. America featured prominently in the curriculum. The instructors taught that the United States was a mongrel nation, racially contaminated, held together by Jewish financial manipulation, and doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. They showed photographs of Depression-era breadlines as evidence of permanent economic failure. They emphasized racial tensions, labor strikes, crime statistics. They taught that Americans were soft, made weak by prosperity and jazz music, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for modern warfare. The military training reinforced these lessons. Klaus's officers in North Africa had assured him that American soldiers were poorly trained, badly equipped, reluctant to fight. That American industry, while large, was inefficient and vulnerable. That American civilians were hysterical and cowardly. That the nation would sue for peace the moment casualties mounted. Every briefing, every propaganda film, every lesson hammered home the same message. Germany was superior in every way that mattered. Klaus had believed it completely. Why wouldn't he? It was all he had ever been taught. The adults in his life, teachers, youth leaders, military officers, government officials, all spoke with the confidence of revealed truth. The newspapers confirmed it. The radio broadcasts reinforced it. The films provided visual evidence. The entire structure of Nazi society was built on the foundation of German superiority and enemy weakness. Then came North Africa. The Americans who captured his unit in Tunisia fought with competence that surprised him, but he rationalized it. Veterans trained by British advisors, perhaps, or an unusually good unit. The transport ship that brought him across the Atlantic was old but functional, adequately supplied. He told himself this proved nothing. America might have ships but lacked the will to use them properly. But now, standing at that porthole watching New York Harbor, Klaus felt the first genuine crack in his certainty. This was not a nation on the verge of collapse. This was not a declining power. This was something else entirely, something vast and powerful and completely different from what he had been promised. The question that formed in his mind was dangerous, almost treasonous. What else had they lied about? The prisoners were marched off the ship under guard, up gangplanks onto American soil. Klaus expected hostility, civilians throwing rocks, screaming at the Germans who had killed their sons. The propaganda had assured them that American civilians were vengeful and undisciplined, prone to mob violence. Instead, dock workers barely glanced at them, too busy with their jobs to care about enemy prisoners. The few who did look showed mild curiosity, nothing more. The trucks that transported them from the harbor were new, mechanically sound, gasoline abundant. The roads were paved, well maintained. They passed through New Jersey industrial zones where factories ran at capacity, smokestacks pumping output that spoke of production on a scale Klaus had never imagined. He had been taught that American industry was primitive compared to German engineering. He had been taught that strategic bombing had crippled American manufacturing capacity. He had been taught lies. On the train west, a train with functioning heating, with regular meals, with guards who seemed more bored than brutal, Klaus began talking with other prisoners. They compared notes, shared observations, tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Some clung to the old explanations. This was all temporary. American strength was illusion. Secret weapons would still deliver German victory. But others, especially the younger ones like Klaus, felt their certainty eroding. "Look at the farms," one prisoner said, pointing out the window at Iowa cornfields stretching to horizons. "When did you last see land that well cultivated in Germany? When did you last see farms with that much equipment?" "The equipment is probably substandard," another insisted. "Quantity over quality. That's the American way." But Klaus was beginning to understand that quantity was its own quality. Germany might produce superior individual tanks, but if America produced 10 tanks for every one German tank, the engineering superiority became academic. He thought about the men he had fought alongside in North Africa. Brave men, skilled men, dying because they ran out of fuel, ran out of ammunition, ran out of food. Not from lack of courage, but from industrial incapacity. The train carried them through American heartland for 3 days. 3 days of witnessing abundance. 3 days of seeing infrastructure that functioned. 3 days of watching a nation that appeared not merely intact but thriving. By the time they reached Camp Concordia in Kansas, Klaus Zimmermann no longer believed in inevitable German victory. He believed only in the enormity of the deception. Camp Concordia materialized out of the Kansas prairie. Rows of barracks surrounded by wire, guard towers at intervals, the architecture of captivity. Yet even here, even in a prison camp, the difference between promise and reality shocked Klaus. The barracks were clean, constructed properly, winterized. The latrines were sanitary. The medical facility was equipped with supplies Klaus had not seen even in German field hospitals in North Africa. There was a library, a recreation area, a canteen where prisoners could purchase items with scrip earned through voluntary labor. This was not the torture camp the propaganda had promised. The camp commander, a Captain Morrison, addressed them on the first day through interpreters. He explained the Geneva Conventions, outlined their rights as prisoners of war, described the daily routines. He emphasized that they would be treated according to international law, that violence against them was prohibited, that they could send and receive mail. His tone was bureaucratic, almost boring, not the theatrical cruelty Klaus had been prepared for. "You will work if you choose to work," Morrison said. "We cannot force you to labor per Geneva Convention rules, but those who work will earn scrip, will have better access to the canteen, will find time passes more quickly. The choice is yours." The political officers among the prisoners, hardcore Nazis who maintained ideological discipline, immediately denounced this as manipulation. Work was slavery, they insisted. Accepting American money was collaboration. Prisoners must resist, must maintain solidarity, must remember their duty to the Reich. But Klaus noticed something those officers did not acknowledge. The American guards were not brutal. They did not beat prisoners for minor infractions. They did not steal from Red Cross packages. They enforced rules but did so without the sadism that characterized the SS and Gestapo back home. When a prisoner fell ill, he received medical treatment. When conflicts arose between prisoners, they were resolved through mediation rather than violence. One evening, Klaus spoke with a guard during his barracks inspection, a young corporal from Wisconsin named Miller, who seemed barely older than Klaus himself. "What happens to us?" Klaus asked in halting English. "After war?" Miller shrugged. "You go home, I guess. Back to Germany. Rebuild your country. You will not keep us as slaves? As forced labor?" Miller looked genuinely confused by the question. "Why would we do that? War ends, prisoners go home, that's how it works." The casual assumption of peace, of return, of normal life resuming, it contradicted everything Klaus had been taught about American barbarism. The work program began within weeks. Prisoners could volunteer for agricultural labor. The war had created massive labor shortages on American farms, and German POWs helped fill the gap. Klaus volunteered, partly for the scrip, partly for something to do, but mostly because he was desperately curious to see more of America beyond the wire. They were trucked each morning to farms in the surrounding counties, supervised by guards but working alongside American civilians, Farmers, their wives, hired hands. The first day on a wheat farm outside of Concordia, Klaus worked alongside the farmer's son, a 16-year-old named Tom, who operated a tractor with casual competence. "You know how to drive?" Tom asked during a break. Klaus shook his head. Few Germans his age knew how to drive. Automobiles were expensive, rare, reserved for the wealthy or military. But here was an American farm boy who apparently had his own vehicle. "I can teach you," Tom offered, "if your guard says it's okay." The guard did say it was okay, with the weary pragmatism of someone who had long ago stopped seeing prisoners as threats. For the next 3 hours, Klaus learned to operate a John Deere tractor, machine that represented more wealth than his entire village in Bavaria had possessed. Tom explained the mechanics with the patient enthusiasm of someone who loved machinery, who saw farming not as peasant labor but as skilled work requiring technical knowledge. During lunch, sandwiches and cold milk, more food than Klaus had eaten in a single meal in months, Tom talked about his plans. College after the war, maybe agricultural school, then back to expand the family farm. He spoke of the future with certainty that Klaus found both enviable and incomprehensible. "How did you plan for the future when the world was burning?" "What about you?" Tom asked. "What did you do before the war? School, Hitler Youth, then Army?" "No. I mean, what did you want to do? What were you interested in?" The question stopped Klaus. He realized with shock that he could not answer it. His entire youth had been consumed by preparation for war. He had never been asked what he wanted, what interested him beyond service to the Reich. The Nazi state had not encouraged individual dreams, only collective destiny. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was never asked." Tom looked at him with something like pity. "Man, that's rough. Everyone should get to decide what they want to be." Summer turned to autumn. Klaus worked the farms, learned English from guards and farmers, observed American life with the intensity of an anthropologist documenting an alien culture. Everything contradicted his training. The abundance shocked him. Not luxury, not decadence, but basic competence. Farms that produced more than families needed, towns with functioning stores, infrastructure that worked, a society that appeared to operate without the constant crisis management that characterized Nazi Germany. The political officers in camp grew increasingly agitated. They held secret meetings, pressed prisoners to resist cooperation, insisted that reports of German military defeats were enemy propaganda. But news filtered in through Red Cross packages, through letters from home, through guards who had no reason to lie. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied forces had invaded Italy. German cities were being bombed. The 1,000-year Reich was not going to last even 12 years. Klaus received a letter from his mother in October. It had been censored heavily, large portions blacked out. But what remained was devastating. His father had been killed in Russia. Their home in Bavaria had been damaged by Allied bombing. Food was scarce. Heat was scarce. Hope was scarce. She wrote carefully, knowing the letter would be read by authorities, but Klaus could read between the lines the exhaustion, the desperation, the growing conviction that Germany had led itself into catastrophe. He sat in the barracks holding that letter, trying to reconcile the suffering described in his mother's careful words with his current situation. He was warm. He was fed. He was safe. His mother, loyal citizen of the Reich, was cold and hungry and in danger. The irony was so bitter it made him physically ill. That night he spoke with other prisoners in his barracks, young men like himself who were beginning to see through the propaganda haze. They shared letters from home, compared notes on what they were witnessing in America, tried to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived. "They told us America was weak," one prisoner said. "They told us Americans were cowards who would surrender after the first defeats. They told us Jewish bankers controlled everything and the system would collapse. None of it was true. None of it." "So what do we do?" another asked. Klaus had no answer. What did you do when everything you believed was revealed as lies? When your nation had led you into a war it could not win based on assumptions that had no connection to reality? When you had sacrificed everything for leaders who had sacrificed you? Winter came to Kansas with shocking severity. The prisoners, issued proper winter clothing by their captors, marveled at American abundance even in the mundane. Klaus received boots, coat, gloves, equipment superior to what he had been issued in the Wehrmacht. The heating in the barracks worked reliably, fed by coal supplies that never seemed to run short. Mail continued to arrive from Germany. each letter describing conditions growing more desperate as the Reich consumed itself. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Klaus and other prisoners watched American guards complain about minor inconveniences, delayed mail, lukewarm coffee, boring food, and wanted to scream. Did they not understand how privileged they were? Did they not comprehend what real deprivation looked like? But gradually Klaus realized that the guards' complaints were not evidence of weakness, but of different expectations. Americans expected things to work properly. When they didn't, Americans complained and demanded improvement. This was not weakness, this was citizenship. In Germany, you accepted what authority provided and were grateful for it. Complaining was suspicious, potentially treasonous. The Nazi state demanded obedience, not input. But here, guards grumbled about their officers, mocked military bureaucracy, openly discussed the stupidity of various regulations, and nothing happened to them. The system tolerated dissent, even encouraged it within limits. This was democracy in action, messy and frustrating and somehow functional. Klaus began reading American newspapers in the camp library, his English now good enough to understand most articles. He read about congressional debates, about criticism of Roosevelt's policies, about labor unions negotiating with companies, about courts ruling against the government. The multiplicity of voices, the open disagreement, the assumption that authority could and should be questioned. It was dizzying after a lifetime of enforced unanimity. He found himself in conversation with Corporal Miller again, the Wisconsin guard who had become something like a friend despite the wire between them. "Why do you allow newspapers to criticize your president?" Klaus asked. "Is this not dangerous? Does it not undermine unity?" Miller laughed. "That's the whole point of free press. Keep the government honest. If they're screwing up, people need to know. But what about enemies? What about people like me reading these criticisms? So what? You think I'm going to lie to you about America having problems? Every country has problems. Difference is we're allowed to talk about ours. We're allowed to fix them without waiting for some dictator to decide." The casual confidence of this answer, the assumption that openness was strength rather than weakness, represented everything Klaus was learning to understand about why Germany was losing. Christmas 1943 approached. The camp administration organized a celebration, though Klaus initially suspected this was propaganda, a photo opportunity to show the world how humanely America treated prisoners. But as preparations progressed, he realized the celebration was genuine, not for external consumption but because Americans believed in Christmas, believed in maintaining traditions, believed that even prisoners deserved humanity during holidays. The mess hall was decorated with paper chains and pine branches. The prisoners, allowed to organize their own program, prepared German Christmas songs. American guards contributed food beyond standard rations: turkey, potatoes, pie, coffee. It was not lavish by American standards, but was feast beyond imagining for men who remembered hunger. Captain Morrison addressed them before the meal, speaking through interpreters with unusual emotion. "I know many of you are far from home tonight. I know you're thinking about your families, wondering if they're safe, if they have enough to eat, if they're warm. I think about my own family the same way. War separates us from the people we love. That's one of its cruelties we all share." Klaus listened, struck by the acknowledgement of common humanity. Morrison was not pretending the prisoners were guests. He was not claiming they were friends, but he was insisting they were human beings, that their suffering mattered, that separation from family was tragedy regardless of uniform. After the meal, prisoners and guards sang together, Silent Night in German and English, the same melody carrying different words. Klaus sang with tears on his face, mourning his father, fearing for his mother, grieving for the world that had been destroyed by leaders who had promised glory and delivered ashes. An older prisoner, a sergeant named Weber, who had fought in Poland and France, sat beside Klaus after the singing ended. "You understand now, yes?" Weber said quietly. "You understand what we did? What we supported?" Klaus nodded. He understood. He understood that Germany had started an aggressive war based on racial mythology and territorial ambition. He understood that the Nazi state had lied systematically to its people about enemies and capabilities. He understood that millions were dying for a vision that had no connection to reality. "What do we do?" Klaus asked. "When we go home? How do we rebuild from this?" Weber looked at the American guards cleaning up, joking with each other, treating even this mundane work with casual efficiency. "We learn from this," he said. We remember what civilization actually looks like, and we make sure Germany never forgets what happens when we abandon it. Spring 1944 brought news of D-Day. The political officers in camp insisted this was disaster for the Allies, that German defenses would throw the invaders back into the sea. But within days it became clear that the invasion had succeeded, that Allied forces were establishing themselves in France, that the liberation of Europe had begun. Klaus felt no joy at this news, but no sorrow either. He had moved beyond nationalism into something more fundamental, a desire for the war to end, for the dying to stop, for humanity to have another chance. He wanted Germany to lose quickly, not from hatred of his homeland, but from recognition that every additional day of fighting meant more deaths for a cause already lost. The guards became more relaxed as Allied victory seemed inevitable. Corporal Miller talked openly about his plans after the war, college on the GI Bill, maybe teaching agriculture, definitely traveling to see the Europe he had only read about. "You should come back," Miller said to Klaus, "after things settle down. Come visit America properly, not as a prisoner. See it the right way." The idea seemed fantastical, that there would be a after, that Germans and Americans might travel freely again, that the war was an interruption rather than permanent condition. But Klaus had learned to trust American confidence about the future. They had been right about everything else. He was transferred in summer 1944 to a work camp in Colorado, part of a program that placed German POWs in agricultural labor throughout the West. The journey west revealed more of America. Mountains and forests and cities he had never imagined existed. Denver looked prosperous, functional, untouched by war's destruction. The farmers he worked for treated him fairly, paid him proper wages, invited him to eat meals with their families. One farmer, a man named Johnson whose son was fighting in France, spoke with Klaus during harvest about the future. "You seem like a good kid," Johnson said. "What the hell were you doing in that Nazi outfit?" Klaus tried to explain. The indoctrination, the pressure, the lack of alternatives, but the words felt inadequate. How did you explain totalitarianism to someone who had grown up with freedom so fundamental they barely recognized it as privilege? "Well," Johnson said finally, "when you get home, you tell people what you saw here. You tell them there's another way to organize society. You tell them dictatorship ain't the only option." Klaus promised he would. It was the least he could do. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Klaus learned of German surrender while working a Colorado wheat field, received the news from Johnson, who drove out to tell him personally. They stood together in the field, American farmer and German prisoner, both understanding that everything had changed. "What happens to us now?" Klaus asked. "You'll be processed," Johnson said, "checked for war crimes, political affiliations. If you're clean, you'll be repatriated eventually. Might take months, might take longer. Germany's a mess right now. They need to figure out how to handle millions of prisoners." Klaus felt no joy at the war's end, no relief, only exhaustion and a deep uncertainty about the future. What was he returning to? Germany was occupied, destroyed, divided. The Nazi state that had shaped his entire youth was gone. What replaced it? Over the following months, as he waited for repatriation, Klaus was allowed more freedom. He worked on Johnson's farm as paid laborer rather than prisoner, lived in bunkhouse with other workers, ate meals with the family. Johnson's son returned from Europe, spoke carefully about what he had seen. Concentration camps, destroyed cities, populations traumatized beyond comprehension. "You knew about the camps?" the son asked Klaus one evening. Klaus shook his head. "We knew Jews were being deported. We were told they were being resettled in the East. We did not know about extermination, or we did not allow ourselves to know. We did not ask questions we knew would be dangerous to ask." The son nodded slowly. "That's the thing about totalitarianism. It makes cowards of everyone, makes you complicit through silence." The judgment was harsh but fair. Klaus had been young, had been indoctrinated, had been caught in systems beyond his control, but he had also chosen not to see, chosen not to question, chosen the comfort of conformity over the danger of conscience. That choice, however understandable, was still a choice. "I will do better," Klaus said. "When I return, I will remember what I learned here. I will help build something different." "See that you do," Johnson said, "because the world can't survive another round of this. Next time the weapons will be worse. The casualties will be beyond imagining. You boys need to make sure there's no next time." Klaus understood he was being given a mission. Bear witness. Remember, Teach. Ensure that the lies that led to this catastrophe were never believed again. Klaus Zimmermann returned to Germany in February 1946, part of a massive repatriation program. The ship that carried him back across the Atlantic was crowded with prisoners, all processing the reality of return. They were going home to a country that no longer existed, not in the form they remembered. The Reich was gone. Germany was occupied by 4 powers. Cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Millions were dead or missing. He arrived in Bremen to find a landscape of destruction that no description had prepared him for. The port facilities were damaged, barely functional. The city beyond was ruins. Buildings reduced to shells, streets cleared of rubble but little else. Refugees everywhere, displaced persons from across Europe, Germans expelled from eastern territories, survivors of camps, orphans, widows, the wounded and traumatized. This was what the 1,000-year Reich had produced, suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. Klaus made his way to Bavaria, to the village where his mother lived with relatives. The journey took days through a destroyed country where trains ran sporadically, where bridges had been bombed, where entire towns had ceased to exist. He saw German civilians in conditions worse than he had experienced as a prisoner in America. The irony was savage. He had been safer, better fed, more humanely treated as an enemy captive than his mother had been as a loyal citizen of the Reich. His mother wept when she saw him, held him with desperation of someone who had lost too much to believe in survival. She had aged terribly, looked 20 years older than when he had left for war. The house was damaged, heating scarce, food rationed to starvation levels. She and his aunt lived by foraging, by bartering, by American and British aid packages that kept millions from starving. Was it worth it? She asked him that first night. Everything we were promised, everything we sacrificed, was any of it worth it? Klaus told her about America, about the abundance he had witnessed, about the kindness of captors who had treated him with dignity, about the lies they had been told, systematic, comprehensive lies about enemy weakness and German superiority, about how the war had been doomed from the start, because the leadership had believed their own propaganda. We were deceived, he said, completely, thoroughly deceived, and millions died because we believed the lies. His mother nodded slowly. So what do we do now? We rebuild, Klaus said, and we make sure this never happens again. The years that followed were brutal. Germany in 1946-1949 was a nation at absolute zero, requiring reconstruction from fundamental principles. Food, shelter, heat, basic survival consumed all energy. But gradually, painfully, society began reorganizing. The occupation powers, despite Soviet brutality in the East, generally followed laws of war. War criminals were prosecuted, democratic institutions were imposed, Marshall Plan aid flowed west. The Deutsche Mark was introduced, economy slowly stabilized. Klaus became a teacher, one of thousands of young Germans tasked with educating a new generation. The curriculum was carefully designed to avoid Nazi contamination, to emphasize democracy and human rights, to ensure students understood what had happened and why. He taught history and civics, taught about Weimar Republic and its failures, taught about how democracies die when citizens stop participating. He spoke often about his time in America, used his experience as case study in how propaganda deceives. He showed students how he had been systematically lied to about enemy nations, how those lies had made rational strategy impossible, how an entire generation had been sacrificed to delusions of leaders who had no connection to reality. I believed it all, he told his classes. I believed America was weak, that we were superior, that victory was inevitable. I believed it because that's all I was taught, because questioning was dangerous, because conformity was easier than courage. And I was wrong about everything, completely catastrophically wrong. He taught them to question authority, to demand evidence, to recognize propaganda techniques, to value truth over comforting lies. He taught them that democracy was not natural or inevitable but required constant work, constant vigilance, constant willingness to participate. He taught them that freedom was fragile and that the price of preserving it was never being comfortable with power going unchallenged. The Federal Republic of Germany emerged from occupation in 1949, a democratic state built on ruins of totalitarian nightmare. It was imperfect, still processing trauma, still learning how to function as democracy, but it was learning. And people like Klaus, people who had seen both systems, who understood viscerally the difference between tyranny and freedom, were determined to make it work. He corresponded with Corporal Miller for years, letters tracking 2 lives in nations that had been enemies and were becoming allies. Miller visited Germany in 1955, stayed with Klaus and his young family, marveled at reconstruction. "You did it," Miller said. "You actually built something better." Klaus shook his head. "We're building. It's not finished. It never will be. But yes, we're trying." In 1963, Klaus Zimmermann was invited to speak at a conference in Kansas, a gathering of former POWs and their American captors, an attempt to process history and build understanding. He traveled to America for the first time since repatriation, flew into New York Harbor, and stood again at the place where he had first realized the magnitude of his deception. The skyline had grown even more impressive. The harbor buzzed with even more activity. The nation that had been powerful in 1943 had become superpower by 1963. Klaus felt again that mixture of awe and shame, awe at what freedom and democracy could build, shame at what his nation had attempted to destroy. At the conference, he spoke to an audience of former prisoners and guards, farmers and soldiers, all processing shared history. He described his arrival in America, his shock at discovering everything he had been taught was lies, his gradual understanding of what democracy meant and required. "They told us you were monsters," he said. "They told us you were weak and degenerate and doomed to collapse. They told us these things to make us willing to die for their vision, and I believed them because I was young and indoctrinated and surrounded by people who all believed the same lies." He paused, looked around the room at faces young and old, German and American, all connected by shared history. "The moment I saw New York Harbor, I knew I had been deceived. The moment an American guard treated me with basic dignity, I knew the propaganda was false. The moment a farmer's son taught me to drive a tractor and asked me what I wanted to be, I knew there was another way to organize human society." His voice broke slightly. "You saved my life. Not just physically, you saved my soul. You showed me that power does not require cruelty, that strength can coexist with mercy, that enemies can be treated with dignity. You taught me what civilization actually means. And I went home and spent 20 years teaching German children the lessons I learned here." Captain Morrison, retired now, silver-haired, stood and embraced Klaus. 2 old men, former enemies, connected by the recognition that what they had built together, peace, understanding, alliance, was more important than the war that had made them enemies. "We learned from each other," Morrison said. "That's what mattered. We learned." Klaus Zimmermann returned to Germany after the conference with renewed sense of mission. The Federal Republic was functioning, prospering, becoming model of successful democracy built from totalitarian ruins. Young Germans grew up without memory of Nazi era, attended universities, traveled freely, participated in government, questioned authority without fear. The system was not perfect, no democracy is, but it worked. It protected rights, allowed dissent, created prosperity, prevented the concentration of power that had made tyranny possible. He continued teaching until retirement in 1975, educating thousands of students about what their grandparents' generation had experienced and why vigilance was eternal price of freedom. He emphasized that democracy was not guaranteed, that every generation had to choose it, had to work for it, had to defend it against those who promised easy answers to complex problems. In his final lecture before retirement, he told students about arriving in New York Harbor in 1943, about the shock of discovering that everything he believed was false, about the Americans who had treated him with dignity when they had every reason to hate him. "I was lucky," he said, "lucky to be captured by Americans who believed in Geneva Conventions and human rights, lucky to spend the war in Kansas rather than dying on Eastern Front, lucky to learn while young enough to change. Millions of my generation were not so lucky. They died believing lies, or they survived to discover that their entire youth had been wasted in service to evil they did not recognize." He looked at the young faces before him, children born long after the war, citizens of a democracy they took for granted. Never believe anyone who tells you that other people are less human than you. Never trust leaders who promise glory through violence. Never accept lies because they're comforting or questioning them is dangerous. The price of failing these principles is everything: your freedom, your humanity, your civilization. Klaus Zimmermann died in 1994, after seeing Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunified. He died knowing that the lessons he had learned in Kansas had shaped the democracy that emerged from Nazi ruins. that American guards who had treated him with dignity had not wasted their decency. That truth, however painful, was always preferable to comforting lies. The war changed men, nations, and truths. If this story made you reflect on propaganda, democracy, and human dignity, remember, what we believe shapes what we become. Choose truth over comfortable lies.